500 million people watched Princess Anne get married the first time. The second time, there were 30. That's not a typo. 500 million to 30. Westminster Abbey to a stone church smaller than most village halls. The Archbishop of Canterbury to a local Scottish minister. A 5-tier wedding cake and a bank holiday. To a Land Rover and a cold December morning in the Highlands. December 12, 1992. The Duke of Edinburgh drives his daughter to Crathie Kirk, near Balmoral. Anne steps out wearing a white suit. No tiara, no 7-foot train, no veil. Just white blossoms in her hair. Her 11-year-old daughter Zara beside her as the only bridesmaid. Inside the church, 30 people are waiting. Her mother, her brothers, her children. A handful of family. That's it. 3 days earlier, the Prime Minister had stood up in Parliament and announced that Prince Charles and Princess Diana were separating. The whole country was talking about that marriage falling apart. Almost nobody was paying attention to the fact that Anne, quietly, privately, without a single word to the press, had already survived hers. Her first marriage had lasted 19 years. It fell apart in silence, and she never blamed anyone. This is that story. And if this is your first time here, this channel tells the stories behind the crown that most people never hear. If that's something you'd like to keep hearing, the like button and subscribe are right there. It takes a second, and it helps more than you'd think. Here's the thing about Anne that makes this story so hard to understand. This is a woman who, at 23 years old, 4 months into her marriage, had an armed man point a pistol at her face on a London street and try to drag her out of her car. He'd already shot her bodyguard. He'd shot her chauffeur. He'd shot a journalist who'd tried to help. And when he told Princess Anne to get out of the car, she looked at him and said, "Not bloody likely. That's who she is. She doesn't go quiet. She doesn't back down. She doesn't let anyone push her around." So why, when her marriage was falling apart for over a decade, when the tabloids were circling, when the betrayals were piling up on both sides, when the most private thing she owned was stolen from her own hands and leaked to the press, did she choose to say nothing? Not a single public word, not a single interview, not a single accusation. If you've watched her for as long as most of us have, you've probably asked yourself that question before. Over the next 40 minutes, we're going to try to find the answer. In April of 1989, somebody walked into Buckingham Palace, the most secure royal residence in Britain, opened Princess Anne's personal briefcase, and took 4 handwritten letters from inside it. The letters were written by Commander Timothy Laurence. He was the Queen's equerry, one of the most trusted positions in the royal household. The letters were personal, they were private, and within days, they were sitting on an editor's desk at The Sun. The newspaper, to its credit, didn't publish them. They handed the letters to the police. Buckingham Palace released a statement confirming only that the letters were from Laurence, and they described him, carefully, as a friend. Scotland Yard opened an investigation. They never found the thief. The contents of those letters have never been made public. 4 letters, a stolen briefcase, a woman whose most private world had just been ripped open, and she still didn't say a word. We'll come back to those letters. Not yet, but before the end. Before Mark Phillips, there was Andrew Parker Bowles. Anne met him at Royal Ascot in 1970. He was a cavalry officer in the Royal Horse Guards, tall, charming, funny, and exactly the kind of man Anne liked. They shared a love of horses, a sharp sense of humor, and a deep dislike of fuss. For a couple of years, they were one of the most talked-about couples in aristocratic circles. But Andrew was Catholic, and a Catholic marriage for the Queen's only daughter wasn't just unlikely, it was, by the conventions of the time, impossible. The Crown and the Catholic Church didn't mix. Not for someone that close to the throne. The relationship ended, and in 1973, Andrew Parker Bowles married someone else, a woman named Camilla Shand. The same Camilla Shand who'd already been involved with Anne's brother Charles. The same Camilla who, decades later, would become Queen Consort. Royal biographer Sally Bedell Smith wrote that the relationship between Anne and Andrew couldn't have been very serious because of the Catholic issue, but the closeness between them never fully disappeared. Andrew became godfather to Anne's daughter Zara. They're still friends today. They still sit together at Ascot. Whether Anne was heartbroken or simply practical about the end of that relationship, nobody outside the family really knows. But what happened next moved fast. Mark Phillips had actually entered the picture years earlier, 1968, at a horse enthusiasts gathering in Mexico City, tied to the Olympics. He was a lieutenant in the Queen's Dragoon Guards. No title, no royal connections, no aristocratic lineage. Just a military man who happened to be one of the best event riders in the country. He'd go on to win Olympic gold with the British team in Munich in 1972. Anne and Mark kept their relationship hidden for 5 years. Not quietly dating, actively hidden. Anne's own press office didn't know. The Queen didn't know. Anne reportedly hid Mark in her tack box at equestrian events to keep him out of sight of the press. A tack box. The Queen's daughter, smuggling her boyfriend around in a storage trunk. When the engagement was finally announced on May 29, 1973, it caught almost everyone off guard. Anne appeared the next morning on the grounds of Buckingham Palace, wearing a sapphire and diamond ring from Gerard. It was deliberately modest, smaller than what people expected for a princess, because Britain was in the middle of an economic crisis, and Anne didn't want to look out of touch. A reporter asked her whether she believed the marriage could survive under the weight of public scrutiny. Her answer, 5 words that would haunt her for decades: can? It's got to, hasn't it? There's something in those 5 words. Not confidence, not romance, something closer to duty. As if she already knew what she was walking into, and she'd decided to walk into it anyway. And then came a decision that, at the time, barely made the news, but looking back, tells you everything about who Anne was even then. The Queen offered Mark an earldom. That was standard. When an untitled man married into the royal family, you gave him a title. It's what happened with Anthony Armstrong Jones when he married Princess Margaret. An earldom would have meant their children could carry courtesy titles. They'd be Lady Zara, Lord Peter. Anne and Mark said no. It was a deliberate choice, and it meant that any children they had would be born as commoners, the first commoner-born children of a senior royal in over 500 years. At the time, it looked modern, progressive, even admirable. In hindsight, it was Anne doing what she'd spend the next 2 decades doing, protecting her children from a world she wasn't sure she trusted. The wedding was November 14, 1973, Westminster Abbey, 2,000 guests inside the church, 27.6 million people watching across Britain, 500 million worldwide. It happened to fall on Prince Charles's 25th birthday, though nobody was paying much attention to him that day. Anne wore Queen Mary's fringe tiara, the same one her mother had worn on her own wedding day. The wedding ring was forged from the same piece of Welsh gold that had been used for her mother's ring, her grandmother's, and her great-aunt's. The dress was designed by Maureen Baker for the Susan Small label, Tudor style, with trumpet sleeves and a 7-foot train. 9-year-old Prince Edward walked behind her as page boy. Lady Sarah Armstrong Jones, Princess Margaret's daughter, served as bridesmaid. The day was declared a special bank holiday. Prince Rainier and Princess Grace of Monaco were among the guests. The 5-tier wedding cake stood the same height as Anne herself, 5 feet 6 inches. And standing at the altar in the full dress uniform of the Queen's Dragoon Guards was Mark Phillips. An ordinary boy, Paul Burrell would later call him. An ordinary boy who'd just married into the most extraordinary family on earth. 4 months later, on a dark evening on Pall Mall, a car would force their limousine to stop, and Anne would face something far more dangerous than any royal wedding. The mid-1970s, Britain running on half power, inflation above 20%, rubbish piling up in the streets during the winter of discontent, the 3-day week. The country felt like it was falling apart at the edges, and in the Gloucestershire countryside, tucked between the villages of Minchinhampton and Avening, a young couple were unpacking boxes in a 730-acre estate the Queen had just bought them. Gatcombe Park. Stables, woodland, a lake full of brown trout, and an airstrip. 32 rooms inside. Outside, the kind of silence you can only find in rural England. March 20th, 1974. Anne and Mark were being driven back to Buckingham Palace after a charity film screening. It was around 8 in the evening. Their limousine, marked with the royal insignia, was heading down the mall when a white Ford Escort swerved in front of them and forced them to stop. A man named Ian Ball got out. He had a pistol. He shot Anne's protection officer, Inspector Jim Beaton, first. Beaton tried to draw his own weapon, a Walther PPK, but it jammed. Ball shot him again. Then he shot the chauffeur, Alex Callender, in the shoulder. Then he shot Brian McConnell, a tabloid journalist who'd been walking past and tried to intervene, in the chest. Ball approached the royal car. He opened the door. He told Anne he was going to kidnap her and hold her for ransom, £2 to £3 million, in a letter already written and addressed to the Queen. Anne was 23 years old. She'd been married for 4 months. She was sitting in a car with an injured bodyguard, an injured driver, and an armed man reaching for her arm. Her reply? Not bloody likely. There was a physical struggle. Ball grabbed Anne's arm and tried to pull her out. Mark grabbed her from the other side and pulled her back in. Her dress tore at the seam. At one point, Anne later recalled, she and Ball had a sort of discussion about where or where not we were going to go. A sort of discussion, with an armed kidnapper. That's how she described it. Ronald Russell, a former heavyweight boxer who happened to be passing by, saw what was happening, walked over, and punched Ball in the back of the head. Police arrived moments later. Ball was tackled to the ground. In his car, they found 2 pairs of handcuffs, Valium tranquilizers, and the ransom letter. 4 people shot. Nobody killed. Anne, completely unhurt. She went back to the palace that evening and, according to multiple accounts, had a cup of tea. Ball was charged with attempted murder and kidnapping. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and sentenced to 41 years in a high-security psychiatric hospital. Hold that image. Hold the woman who said, not bloody likely to a man with a gun, because you're going to need it for everything that comes next. Peter Phillips was born in 1977, the Queen's first grandchild. Zara followed in 1981, both born at St. Mary's Hospital in Paddington, in the Lindo Wing. Anne was the first royal to give birth there, starting a tradition that would continue through Kate Middleton decades later. Neither child was given a title. Peter Phillips, Zara Phillips. No prince, no princess. No, Your Royal Highness. Just 2 kids growing up at Gatcombe Park with horses, dogs, muddy boots, and a degree of normality that was almost unheard of for the Queen's grandchildren. But after Zara's birth, the marriage started to shift. Slowly, at first, then not slowly at all. Mark stopped showing up to royal engagements. He poured himself into equestrian business, a riding school in Scotland, course design work, coaching clinics abroad. Anne went the other direction. She threw herself deeper into royal duties, year after year, logging more engagements than any other member of the family. They traveled separately. Not occasionally, routinely. When they did travel together on overseas trips, they reportedly booked separate hotel rooms. The Chicago Tribune put it plainly. Both seemed to delight in foreign travel, separately. Inside the family, the distance was hard to miss. Prince Charles had given Mark a nickname, and it stuck. Fog, because he was, in Charles's estimation, thick and wet. Daily Mail editor Richard Kay later confirmed that the nickname came directly from royal sources. Paul Burrell, the Queen's former butler, confirmed it publicly in the 2002 Channel 4 documentary, The Real Princess Anne. He said Andrew and Edward, Anne's younger brothers, turned it into a game. They used to have a joke, Burrell said. Let's see how long it is before Foggy talks about a horse, and they would time him to the second. Burrell's verdict on Mark was blunt. Royal life brings stresses and strains on those who marry into it. Mark Phillips was generally an ordinary boy, and he couldn't survive it. By the mid-1980s, it wasn't a secret to anyone paying attention. People magazine described what Anne and Mark had as a loveless union just drifting along. They used the phrase mutual indifference and noted that the couple had made little effort to disguise it. Even Mark's own father, Major Peter Phillips, said it out loud to a reporter. What Mark and Anne have is not what I would think of as married life, he said, but it is up to them how they lead their lives. A man's own father saying publicly that his son's marriage didn't look like a marriage. And still, Anne said nothing. And it was around this time, with the marriage already hollowing out from the inside, that a young detective sergeant named Peter Cross was assigned to the Royal Protection Squad and became Princess Anne's personal bodyguard. What happened between them would stay buried for years. Now, those letters. Commander Timothy Laurence had been serving as the Queen's equerry since 1986. That wasn't a distant, ceremonial role. The equerry lives inside the royal household. He eats with the family. He travels with them on the royal yacht. He stands beside them at state functions and handles the introductions when foreign dignitaries arrive. He's there, Every day, in the same corridors, at the same dining table, inside the same world. Laurence was there during the years Anne's marriage was quietly falling apart. He saw the separate schedules. He saw the silence between Anne and Mark. He saw what the public didn't. The letters he wrote to her weren't written from the outside looking in. They were written by someone standing right next to her, watching her carry something she'd never once talked about. That's all we need to know for now. There's more to come. In 1979, a detective sergeant named Peter Cross was transferred from Scotland Yard's South London Division to the Royal Protection Squad. He was assigned as Princess Anne's personal bodyguard. Within a year, he was gone. Removed from his position, the official explanation was that he'd become too close to the princess. Harry Arnold, the Sun reporter who first broke the story, explained in the 2002 Channel 4 documentary how carefully the language had to be chosen. I was told from an absolutely amazing source that he was having an affair with Princess Anne, Arnold said. I couldn't use the word affair, so I invented the phrase that he became over-familiar with Princess Anne. Over-familiar? That was the word that made it into print. Everyone understood what it meant. After Cross was removed from royal duties, the contact didn't stop. Anne allegedly used a code name when calling him, Mrs. Wallace. She'd ring from Gatcombe or from Palace lines, and Cross's colleagues would take the message without knowing who was really on the other end. Gillian Nichols, Cross's partner at the time, confirmed to the Daily Mail that she personally fielded Anne's calls at the office where they both worked during the early 1980s. His affair with her always overshadowed our relationship, Nichols said. It always felt like she was there in the background. Just before Christmas 1980, a royal detective showed up at Cross's door with a card and a box of biscuits from Anne. The detective asked for his phone number to give to the princess. Soon after, Cross was invited to Gatcombe Park. He later recalled that Anne met him in the library. They talked, they held hands, they kissed. Anne told him, "If you ever feel like a day in the country, you know you're very welcome." A day in the country became their code. In 1985, Cross sold the story to the tabloids. Anne never responded, never confirmed, never denied, never said a single word about any of it. Mark wasn't faithful either, not even close. He was linked to TV journalist Angela Rippon, former Miss India Pamela Bordes, and Toronto-based PR consultant Kathy Burks. He denied every one of them. But there was one he couldn't deny. In November 1984, Mark was in Auckland, New Zealand, running an equestrian coaching clinic. He met Heather Tonkin, a local art teacher. According to reports, he left his riding boots outside his hotel room door that night so she could find the right room. Felicity was born in August 1985. At the time, Zara was 4 years old. When Heather told Mark she was pregnant, he tried to convince her to end the pregnancy. She refused. He denied everything. His business agent, James Erskine, sat down with Heather for a recorded meeting and told her plainly, "If you want to cause a flap, everyone's just going to deny it." He warned her that the clout lay with Mark, and that if the story went public, your daughter's life will be ruined. Payments were sent to Heather. They were labeled equestrian consultancy. For 6 years, that's what they called child support. Equestrian consultancy. Heather fought quietly for years. "I am doing what I am doing for my child," she said. "I hope and pray Mark will do the right thing and make a proper and legally binding settlement on her. Nothing can compensate for the tears I have cried while trying to plan for Bunny's future, when at any moment I could find myself penniless." Bunny. That was Felicity's nickname. A little girl in New Zealand who had no idea who her father really was, until she was 8 years old and a school project asked her to draw her family tree. After that, she kept a book about Mark Phillips by her bed. She spent hours reading about the British family she'd never met. A former boyfriend of Heather's later said, "She'd have liked a card or something, some sort of recognition. I saw her cry about it." Felicity's grandmother, Dr. Shirley Tonkin, would later confirm to the Daily Mail that no one from the Phillips family ever reached out. Zara has never been in touch with her. Nobody has. A half-sister, 4 years younger than Zara, growing up on the other side of the world, and no one in the royal family ever picked up the phone. Now hold all of that. The Peter Cross affair, the separate hotels, the code names, the riding boots outside the hotel door, the little girl in New Zealand, and think about what was happening inside Gatcombe Park during those same years. Peter and Zara were growing up, going to school, riding horses, eating dinner at the kitchen table, being children. and Anne kept it all running. The house, the horses, the routines, the school runs, the appearances, the royal engagements, more than any other member of the family, year after year after year. She didn't leak to the press. She didn't sit for a sympathetic interview. She didn't call a journalist and whisper her side of the story into a tape recorder. While Diana, across the same decade, inside a different failing royal marriage, would eventually choose to speak, Anne chose the opposite. She chose silence. Not the silence of someone who's been silenced. The silence of someone who decided, on her own terms, that whatever was breaking inside her home wasn't going to be broken in public. And then, in April of 1989, someone reached into her briefcase inside Buckingham Palace and took the only evidence of what had been keeping her going. Spring, 1989. Margaret Thatcher still in Downing Street. The Berlin Wall still standing, though not for much longer. Madonna's Like a Prayer, playing on every radio in Britain. And somewhere in the corridors of Buckingham Palace, a police investigation that would never be solved, into a theft that would never be explained, from a briefcase that belonged to the Queen's only daughter. The palace statement was precise. Careful, every word chosen like it had been passed through 3 layers of legal review, which it probably had. The stolen letters were addressed to the Princess Royal by Commander Timothy Laurence, the Queen's equerry. We have nothing to say about the contents of personal letters sent to Her Royal Highness by a friend which were stolen and which are the subject of a police investigation. A friend. That single word did an enormous amount of work. It acknowledged the letters existed, it confirmed who wrote them, and it drew a line, politely, firmly, that the palace had no intention of crossing. Everyone understood what it meant. A friend doesn't write the kind of letters that get stolen from someone's briefcase and end up on a tabloid editor's desk. A friend doesn't become headline news. Someone close to Laurence spoke to the press afterward. They didn't use his name, but what they said told the story that the palace statement had carefully avoided. Tim has filled a loneliness in her life and given her a shoulder to cry on when she needed someone to tell her troubles to. He cares for her in the way her husband does not. Detective Chief Superintendent Roy Ram led the investigation. He later spoke about the case in the 2002 Channel 4 documentary. The thief was never identified. No arrest was ever made. Whoever walked into Buckingham Palace and opened that briefcase walked away clean and took Anne's privacy with them. And still, she said nothing. 4 months later, August 31st, 1989, Anne was in Puerto Rico at the annual meeting of the International Olympic Committee. Mark was at Gatcombe. They weren't in the same country. They weren't even on the same continent. Buckingham Palace released a statement. Her Royal Highness, the Princess Royal, and Captain Mark Phillips have decided to separate on terms agreed between them. And then the line that carried more weight than anything else in that statement. There are no plans for divorce proceedings. 7 words. That was Anne's concession to the institution she'd been born into. The royal family didn't divorce. Not easily, not publicly, not without cost. Princess Margaret's divorce in 1978 had been the first for a senior royal in centuries. The memory of that still hadn't faded. Anne wasn't ready to be the next one, so she separated. But she didn't divorce, not yet. She left the door open, at least on paper, even though everyone around her knew it was already closed. Mark stayed at Gatcombe. He moved into Aston Farm, a smaller property on the estate. They lived on the same land. They shared the same driveway. They just didn't share a life anymore. For 2 years, that's where it stayed. Separated but not divorced. Living on the same estate but in different houses. The children, Peter, 12, and Zara, 8, moving between their parents without ever leaving the property. Then, in 1991, Heather Tonkin forced the issue. She took Mark to court. A DNA test was ordered. The result confirmed what Mark had spent 6 years denying. Felicity was his daughter. A settlement of approximately £350,000 was agreed. His name still never appeared on Felicity's birth certificate. That was the end of it. Not the affairs, not the separate hotels, not the stolen letters, not the years of drifting. It was the DNA test, the undeniable, public, scientific proof that he'd fathered a child with another woman while they were still married, that made Anne pick up the phone and call her lawyers. She filed for divorce on April 13th, 1992. 10 days later, on April 23rd, a judge granted it. The hearing lasted less than 5 minutes. Some reports say 4. 18 years of marriage, dissolved in under 5 minutes. And even then, even at the very end, it was described as mutual. No blame assigned, no accusations made, no public statements from either side beyond what the palace released. Peter was 14, Zara was 11, their parents' marriage was legally over, and Anne, characteristically, made sure Mark could still see them whenever he wanted. He kept Aston Farm. The children moved between houses on the same property, no custody battle, no restraining orders, no tabloid war, just a quiet rearrangement of the geography. Anne's divorce was finalized in April. By December of that same year, 3 more royal marriages would collapse, a castle would burn, and the Queen would stand at a lectern and use a phrase nobody in Britain had ever heard before. A Land Rover on a cold December morning, a stone church in the Scottish Highlands, 30 guests, no cameras, no tiara, no train, the smallest royal wedding in modern history, and it was getting closer by the day. 1992 didn't break the royal family all at once. It broke them in stages. March. Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson announced their separation. The tabloids had already been running photos of Fergie on holiday with a Texan oil millionaire. The palace couldn't contain it. April. Anne's divorce was finalized. 18 years. Less than 5 minutes in a courtroom. Almost no coverage. The country barely noticed. That summer, Andrew Morton published Diana, Her True Story. The book blew the doors off everything. Charles's affair with Camilla, Diana's suffering, the bulimia, the loneliness, the desperate phone calls. It was the most devastating account of a royal marriage ever put into print. Diana had secretly cooperated with Morton, supplied him with tape recordings, though that wouldn't be confirmed until after her death. November 20th, Windsor Castle caught fire. A faulty spotlight in a private chapel ignited a blaze that burned for 15 hours and destroyed 115 rooms, 225 firefighters, nearly £50 million in damage. The oldest inhabited castle in the world, gutted from the inside. 4 days later, the Queen stood at the Guildhall in London. She had a cold, her voice was hoarse, and she said something no British monarch had ever said before. 1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis. December 9th, Prime Minister John Major stood up in the House of Commons and announced that the Prince and Princess of Wales were separating. The whole country stopped. Every newspaper, every television bulletin, every conversation in every living room in Britain. 3 days after that, Anne got married again, and almost nobody was talking about it. Of every royal marriage that fell apart that year, Anne's was the quietest. No tell-all book, no panorama interview, no leaked phone recordings, no War of the Waleses splashed across every front page for months. While her brother's marriage collapsed in the loudest, most public, most painful way possible, in front of the entire world, Anne's had already ended, months earlier, almost in silence. And here's what matters about that. Diana chose to speak. Anne chose not to, and neither of them was wrong, but they were very different women, and the silence or the speech came from very different places. Diana needed to be heard because she'd spent years being silenced. She'd been told to keep quiet, to play the part, to smile, to endure, and she couldn't do it anymore. Speaking was survival for her. It was the only weapon she had left. Anne was different. Anne didn't speak because she'd never felt the need to be heard in that way. She wasn't suppressing pain. She wasn't performing strength. She wasn't making a strategic decision to stay quiet for the sake of the institution. She was simply, and this is the part most people miss, private. Not performing privacy, not using silence as a tactic, just private. The way some people are left-handed. It wasn't something she chose. It was something she was. If you've been with us for 35 minutes, what you've watched is a marriage that lasted 19 years come apart slowly, painfully, and almost entirely without sound. And what comes next has been earned. Those letters. They were never published, not a single line. Their content remains unknown to this day. The thief was never caught. The investigation led nowhere. And Anne, whose most private correspondence had been stolen from inside the most secure building in the country, never addressed it. Not publicly, not in a single interview, not in a single documentary, not in a single aside to a journalist at a reception. The palace called Timothy Laurence a friend. Anne let that word stand. She didn't correct it. She didn't expand on it. She didn't issue a follow-up statement clarifying the nature of the relationship. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain herself. She just let it sit there, a friend, and moved on. And that's the key to understanding everything about how Princess Anne handled the end of her first marriage, not what was in those letters. We'll probably never know that. What matters is what she did when they were taken from her, which was nothing. Nothing public, nothing angry, nothing performative, nothing at all. Every other piece of her private life that had leaked over the years, the Peter Cross rumors, the Heather Tonkins scandal, the separate hotels, the years of silence at Gatcombe, she'd absorbed all of it without a single public comment. But the letters were different. The letters were hers. Someone reached into her personal belongings and took them. The most intimate thing she had, written proof that someone cared about her during the loneliest years of her marriage, was stolen from her hands and handed to a tabloid. And she still didn't flinch. The people who were there, the ones who watched it from the inside, have said more about it than Anne ever did. Paul Burrell, in the 2002 Channel 4 documentary, put it simply, royal life brings stresses and strains on those who marry into it. Mark Phillips was generally an ordinary boy and he couldn't survive it. Royal journalist Angela Levin, who covered Anne for years, said something that stuck. She wasn't spiteful, she wasn't bitter. 6 words. And they tell you more about Anne than 100 interviews ever could. Years later, in 2020, Vanity Fair asked Anne about the decision not to give her children royal titles. She didn't frame it as a sacrifice. She didn't frame it as a statement. She said, "I think most people would argue that there are downsides to having titles, so I think that was probably the right thing to do." That was it. No grand philosophy, no regret, just probably the right thing to do. And Zara, the little girl who grew up at Gatcombe without a title, without a princess in front of her name, without any of the weight that came with being the Queen's granddaughter, confirmed it herself. On the 7 Rob Burrow podcast in December 2023, she said, "From my point of view, I was obviously very lucky that my mother didn't give us any titles, so I really commend her on that. We were very lucky that we got to do it a bit our own way. Do it a bit our own way. That's what Anne gave them. Not privilege, not protection from the truth. Just enough distance from the institution to let them figure out who they were on their own terms. Anne herself, speaking to the BBC's Country File about Gatcombe, the place where she'd raised her children, survived her marriage, rebuilt her life, said, "It's really nice to come back and just be yourself in an area like this. This is not something that comes free. This has got to pay its way, otherwise I can't stay here." She wasn't talking about the estate. Not really. She was talking about the life she'd built after everything fell apart. A life that worked because she'd made it work, quietly, without credit, without complaint. She never blamed Mark. She let him stay on the estate. She co-parented without conflict. They ran the Gatcombe horse trials together for 40 years. The man who'd been nicknamed Fog, and the woman who'd never once told the press what he'd done. They stood in the same fields, at the same events, raising the same children, year after year after year. That's not performed dignity. That's not a PR strategy. That's not even forgiveness, exactly. It's just who she is. December 12th, 1992. 3 days after John Major had stood in Parliament and announced the end of Charles and Diana's marriage. The whole country was still reeling from that news. Nobody was looking at Anne, which was exactly how she wanted it. Inside Crathy Kirk, a stone church near Balmoral so small it could barely hold a Sunday congregation, 30 people were waiting. Anne's mother, her father, her brothers, her children, a handful of close family. That was the whole list. The Duke of Edinburgh drove his daughter to the church himself, in a Land Rover. No motorcade, no outriders, just a father driving his daughter down a Scottish lane in December. Anne stepped out wearing a simple white suit. No tiara, no 7-foot train, no veil, white blossoms in her hair. 11-year-old Zara walked beside her, her only bridesmaid. She married Commander Timothy Laurence, the man whose letters had been stolen, the man the palace had called a friend, the man who'd been standing beside her inside the royal household during the years when everything else was coming apart. The Church of England wouldn't allow the ceremony in England. Divorcees couldn't remarry in Anglican churches at the time, so they married in Scotland, where the Church of Scotland had no such objection. Anne became the first royal divorcee to remarry since Princess Victoria Melita of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in 1905. Diana wasn't there. She'd sent her best wishes but stayed away, so the wedding wouldn't become a media circus. That was Diana protecting Anne in her own way. After the ceremony, Anne and Timothy walked out of the tiny church into the December cold. About 500 people had gathered on the road outside Balmoral, and they cheered. They've been married for over 30 years now, still at Gatcombe, still together, still quiet, the Land Rover, the small church, the 30 guests. It wasn't a downgrade from the first wedding, it was an upgrade. She'd spent 19 years inside a marriage that was too big, too public, and too broken. And when she finally found the right person, she made sure the wedding was the right size too. She'd found the right size for a life. There's more to tell about the family behind the crown, stories that don't make the front pages, the ones that happen in the quiet rooms, behind the closed doors, in the years between the headlines, the stories most people never hear. If this one meant something to you, if Anne's story is one you've thought about before, or one you'll think about differently now, share it with someone who'd want to hear it. And if you'd like to stay with us for the next one, you're welcome here, always.